the first book that featured Caesar and his world, and then the second book I wrote, which was about the Persian Wars, so Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis. Writing both of them, trying to get inside the heads of the Romans, the Greeks. I felt a kind of dawning sense of just how alien they were, just how strange they were, and the assumptions that had governed a lot of my, right the way from childhood when I'd first started reading about them, that they weren't that different to us, that in so many ways Greece and Rome were the seedbed from which the Western civilization emerged. I increasingly came to doubt that. And I came to think, I mean, not originally, but it is, I mean, it's not a perspective that is universally taken at the moment. But I came to think that what really changed was the coming Christianity, and that the incubating of Christianity within the Roman Empire was really what was most significant about the entire sweep of Roman history.
Okay.
And I wanted to stress test that thesis by looking at the moment that I kind of think is where a distinctively Western form of Christianity emerges, and therefore, basically the West emerges,
yes.
which I came to identify with the 10th and 11th centuries, so the period around the year 1000. And as the kind of the build up to that, I looked at the collapse of Roman power and the emergence of the barbarian kingdoms and how they they became Christian, and the way in which a lot of the rubble of the collapsed empire in the West was reused and recycled, and the degree to which the stamp, the memory, the aftershocks of the Roman period endured right the way, for centuries and centuries. And I remember looking particularly at the Theodoric's buildings in Ravenna, and thinking how, you mentioned dinosaurs, how they were kind of like the Archaeopteryx, the midway point between theropod dinosaurs and birds, kind of evolutionary midway point. And then I looking at that and thinking about that, obviously came to think about the Dome of the Rock, which similarly has that slight Archaeopteryx quality. It seemed to me that the dome was, of course, very Roman architectural feature, that it has mosaics, that it's on a site that was politically, culturally, religiously sensitive in the Roman period, and to wondering, well, to what extent were the early years of the Arab Empire? Did the Arab rulers of this empire have a similar relationship to Rome and to Persia as, I don't know, the Franks or the Goths in the West had to Rome? And that was the question I wanted to ask myself. And it was probably a foolish project to have undertaken. Firstly, because I didn't really have the languages. I didn't have Arabic. And secondly, because, of course, I realized very rapidly that this was a question that opened up all kinds of very, very sensitive questions. And I found myself in the middle of what was effectively, I think in some ways, possibly the most stimulating academic debate in the whole field of historiography anywhere. Certainly it was in the early 2010s when I embarked on it. And nobody had really written about it from a non-academic perspective for a non-academic audience. So the process of deciding how to write it, there was a kind of two-layer thing. I had to decide what I thought, it's kind of absolutely immersive process of immersing myself in very, very dense, complicated literature, and then deciding how I was going to frame it for the general reader. So it was by miles the most challenging book I've written.
So the image you give of the Dome of the Rock and the larger question of the emergence of Islam with the backdrop of empire, both Byzantine, Roman, and Persian, or more generally, the question of late antiquity and Islam's emergence. I mean, that is still the question for people who work on early Islam. It continues to be. There was a major book by a scholar named Aziz Al-Azmi entitled The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity, which takes a very distinctive anti-revisionist approach, quite rigorous book. I mean, it's not just apologetics, very, very serious academic book. In fact, people complain that its writing is too complicated to be understood by most people. But I mean that was prescient, that insight about thinking through Islam with a backdrop of empire and late antiquity. It continues to be debated. Here at Notre Dame, I teach a seminar on Islamic origins. I have a visiting scholar now who's come from Turkey to study the Qur'an in late antiquity, sitting in the seminar, and this is sort of an issue which transcends Western scholarship. Increasingly in Islamic countries, there's interest in this. I did want to ask.
Because it was the Quran that obviously I came to realize stood at the heart of the question, because I am not a Muslim, so I don't think it came from God. So therefore, if I'm writing, and I think that this is a discipline that a popular writer perhaps has to face up to more rigorously than an academic writer. I've read loads and loads of academic accounts, studies of early Islam that do not overtly grapple with the horns of this particular bull. If you do not think the Quran comes from God, then you have to explain where it comes from, and that requires you providing an alternative explanation. And I think that it's a text of human origin, and therefore you have to say, well, what might the human origins have been?
Most people,
and obviously it's
incredibly
difficult. Obviously, it's incredibly difficult, because the only account we have of how the Quran comes into being is the Muslim one.
Is the religious.
So you're kind of groping around in a dark room.
Well, most people, they simply will attribute agency to the Quran itself. The Quran says this, the Quran says that, or maybe speak obtusely about the Quran's author says this or that. I mean,
yes, but what do they mean by that? Exactly. It's very, and the thing is, I think that if you are a scholar talking to scholars, everyone is so familiar with the context that perhaps that is all read. But if you are writing for a general audience who know nothing about it, and you're saying, actually, the Quran didn't come from an angel, didn't come from God, your reader is going to want you to explain, well, okay, where did it come from then?
Right. Well, I've noted that scholars who enter into Quranic studies or early Islamic studies from other fields oftentimes remark that this field looks different. Islamic studies looks different. People speak in different ways. They're more careful. They don't ask the same questions. For example, I don't want to, as my kids would say, throw shade on this particular book because it's very useful, but the Study Quran, published by HarperCollins, is more or less a constructive theological project. Extremely useful, has lots of resources. It's a compendium of Islamic commentary, but it doesn't look like the Study Bible, also published by HarperCollins, at all. I don't know if that resonates with you, that you sort of
very much so,
into a different landscape, different conversation.
Yeah, very much so, because I wasn't immersed in biblical scholarship, but I knew enough about it to know that there'd been a kind of almost 2-century process of scholars crawling over the biblical text, like gnawing away at it, devouring any sense of it being a whole, and systematically saying, well, where did this come? When was it written? How was it written? What might the authors have been? What's the history of its transmission? When was it canonized? All these kind of questions. And none of this seemed to really be a feature of the study of the Quran. And one of the reasons why I found Patricia Crone, who you mentioned, so helpful was that she did seem to be asking these questions and in some way providing answers, as did Fred Donner as well, who was also in the film.
Yes.
So he, I think it's the collection of essays that you edited on the Quran in late antiquity, and he opens with a brilliant essay where he says that some of the most fundamental questions that every other person who writes about an ancient text takes for granted. We have no answer to them. Who wrote it? Where was it written? When was it canonized? Even what language was it written in? That these remain subjects of furious debate. So it was, as an outsider and a non-specialist, it was a very, very grueling project to attempt.
I would also add just a quick coda maybe to this conversation, and then I have one more question about the project on Islam. But there is a very intriguing trend in early Islamic studies, Quranic studies, where increasingly a younger generation of scholars, Muslim and non-Muslim, but above all Muslim. I mean, most younger scholars in the West in this field are Muslims, some religious, some not religious, but at least coming from a Muslim context. They are engaging more and more with late antiquity and biblical tradition. Obviously, when it comes to thinking about the Quran, it's not just the Bible, it's all the Jewish and Christian texts. And I would very humbly add that exploring the Quran and the Bible is a good example of that sort of work. So there's lots of younger scholars. So I'm slightly
but you hadn't written that when I when I did mine. I wish you had.